Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable discussion of a single story at a time. StoryTalk is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our Patreon page or by going to our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number 1weekcritique.com. I'm Ingrid Wenzler, here with Adam al-Sirgany.
Hello.
And Matthew Schmidt.
Also hello.
Today we'll take Dog Days by Judy Budnitz as our focus. A short story from Budnitz's debut collection, Flying Leap. In places, Dog Days reads almost like a journal or a ship's log. It pays attention to what French philosopher Henri Bergson would call objective time, the easily measurable scientific time of watches and calendars, as well as what Bergson would call, I don't know how to pronounce this in French, but la durée, duration, time that's felt, lived, acted, the time that belongs to our inner selves. The setting, revealed mostly in broad strokes, is a suburb somewhere in America. It's an imagined America in a future time where wartime conditions and a form of an end-time scenario are in tension. There are no animals around. Quote, even the crickets are gone. The story alternates between present tense scene and moments of past and present tense reportage that are similar in scope to journal entries. All of these scenes and moments of reportage are in the first person. All of them are from the perspective of a young narrator named Lisa. Lisa notices what happens in a particular month when the roads are closed off, when the power is shut off, what the neighbors are doing, when her mother begins to stay in bed most of the time, how the behaviors and routines of the members of her immediate family gradually change. She also tracks the behavior of a man in a dog suit who comes to visit the family. This story, you could say, is about that man and what happens to him over time. Okay, so I've done my best to briefly describe the world that we've found ourselves in.
Yeah.
I'd like to begin, though, by getting our listeners a little better situated. Where are we in this story? What do we know about the war and the conditions at hand? And without going into too much depth, can you briefly identify the story's main characters? If you need me to remind you of those questions, too.
I think I'm just still stunned by the normalcy with which you state the man in the dog suit. But obviously, a main character.
Yeah, I just live in this world.
Well, for our viewers, his name is Prince.
And then you have Lisa's mother and father who don't actually get names.
Harold.
Does she? Oh, yeah, she does call him by his name one time.
We don't get the mother's name, I don't think.
And then her two increasingly pimply, stinking brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Elliot and Pat.
Those are we also have her friend.
Marjorie.
And various beggars, neighbors peeping behind windows, military men driving around, punishing people, or just maintaining the martial law state. Which is to say, we don't actually know. It is a martial law state, right? Everything's shut down. Slowly the roads close off so that you can't exit. But Lisa actually mentions at one point she's uncertain of who the war is against, which even for a child is pretty dense. If it's,
typical of her as the character,
yeah.
I would say.
Well, also she has a mature kind of set of speculations about who could be mad, or at least a quippy set of speculations about who could be at war with them. But I think, ultimately we don't know what that's about. We just see the manifestations of the closing off, the government's providing military rations in lieu of their ability to get food, which leads the father to hunting, which he seems to be interested in anyway. the newspapers come in and Harold, the father, doubts it. What's in the papers, but religiously reads them end to end because TV is shut off, so they're losing contact that is not regulated for them, and they don't have options to escape, which is a good way to create a bottle episode in a story, but it doesn't fill in the gaps about why these things are going on, for sure.
I mean, I guess where we're at technically is December, almost a year, about 10 months after this has started, at least according to the story, right? It does say last February. We end the story in December. So we're at the point of pandemonium and road closures and no food and no water, and the story kind of goes back and intersperses some action that happened, as well as remembers some of the things that used to happen, that they used to do. But yeah, I mean, I guess the thing about the characters is, outside of Lisa, we don't know a whole bunch about these characters.
Yeah, that actually kind of leads into my next question, which is, like, when it comes to scene and setting and characterization also, like the world of the story and the people within it, what has Budnitz held back specifically? What don't we know?
Where we're at. What war is happening. If it's a specific war, it may not be. Just the continuing violence or war that America continues to be involved in. But she holds back a lot of, like, what the people did. Like, so we know Elliot and Pat are in high school. We know Lisa is in either middle school or elementary school. It's not exactly clear, I don't think. We know that the father worked at a factory, but we don't know the factory. Mm-hmm. So, like, we know, like, this person is in, like, this stage of their life. And beyond that, you know, there's not a whole lot of information other than wherever they're located. At one point, people either from that place or nearby places thought it would be best to go to this place and try to seek out food, water, shelter.
Yeah, I think the Dr. Schmidt here has laid out a pretty accurate interpretation of what we're missing. It's right, like, in some ways, reading this, I think of, like, an Ionesco play, not only because of the weirdness of, like, the human-animal thing, but because the sort of theater of the absurd use of blank space in the background, or, like, ambiguous space in the background so as to foreground the sort of oddity of the events. I think that one thing that the theater of the absurd does often is really highlight the specificity of sort of the language between people and draw out sort of character responses to that stuff. I mean, similarly, you know, like, it makes me think of Kafka in some ways, in that the setting is just the backdrop of the vehicle into which this other thing is going, right? It's the vessel. I think for Budnitz, she's most interested in Lisa's mental progression over time, and I think to some degree the mother's mental progression, way more than she's invested in the details of the war that are causing this thing to carry on. So we actually get, I mean, you know, we're all sort of re-entering the world still after a pandemic, and I think there's something pretty accurate about the way that she lays out the slow disturbance of life and the sort of like waves of excitement and things like hanging out with your friend and like hanging by your knees or whatever, and like having time and space to be excited that school gets out in April, but like the slow creep toward depression and wanting to like interact and wanting normalcy again. I think that's actually what Budnitz is following. So in some ways, maybe it doesn't. It's not that it doesn't matter at all, but it doesn't really matter whether or not this is. I think this is America, but it doesn't particularly matter if it's Toronto or St. Louis. You know, like, it's not.
You know, Toronto's in Canada, right?
I do.
Okay.
I stated that I think it's
a
in
joke.
America.
It's a joke. Anyway, can I just say one thing? Like, I think Adam's point about like information is important in that because Lisa's young, she's not allowed the amount of information that, say, her father is, who is reading the paper when it comes and watching the TV when it's still on, the news specifically. But even the father says, you know, what they tell us in the news isn't actually true. You can't believe any of it. And so, like, we're getting the story from someone that's at a double remove from information, and thus, like, literally just describing what she has access to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think all of that is tremendously well put, and I mean, I think for me, like, something that I notice in terms of the story's minimalism and what it's held back in terms of, like, the larger setting, and its particularity in terms of tracking the day-to-day is, I mean, that those things sit by side one another, like, really nicely and end up kind of drawing attention to one another. And, you know, I think I would add, too, that, like, in terms of, like, Lisa and her father and what we don't have access to, because our knowledge is limited, there are a lot of questions that come out of, like, well, like, what kind of government this is. Like, is it truly a sort of totalitarian type government where information is limited or skewed, or, you know, is the father saying that as in the way that we all say that about the news sometimes? It's unclear, and importantly so, I think. So looking at the treatment of time in this story, because it's a story that's a little obsessive in terms of its tracking of time, and not. I think Budnitz has a real gift for moving deftly from present tense scenes, like I mentioned earlier, to moments of reportage. And I'd like to look at time in this story and how it relates to change. How does Budnitz move time? Can you give me a couple of examples? And how does that relate to, you know, the changes that we start to see in the characters and setting?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways, right, like, I think Budnitz doesn't overthink it, and that's part of the virtue. In that, like, most of it, we're sort of present tense, this thing is happening, right? Most of the story is actually in present tense. But she actually, when she is moving through that story to maintain the present tense, multiple times says, September now, you know, or I think it's September now, and it's just the sentence October now, period. But she also, right, moving in the past tense, April, and then tells you that school had let out early, so that we're moving through that. The actual story begins with Prince's appearance as just a guy in a dog suit, and that's in the present tense. And so mostly, right, to your point about the story being Prince's story or Lisa's relationship to Prince's story, the present tense is mostly about following that, and that context is in the past. But it also, I mean, it does feel like that, you know, I don't know if, you know, people ever actually sat in the Bastille and, like, clawed, like, dates on the wall, but, like, I mean, you can kind of, it's a little bit like that, like, in everything else being monotonous and moving forward, and the brothers trading their clothes and never switching them out, and slowly not, changing her underwear anymore, and her mother not having the energy to care that she isn't changing her underwear anymore, right? Like, all that kind of stuff. I think to feel like, it's your thing with Bergson, right? Like, that whole deal with, like, the difference between measured time and experienced time is when there aren't, right? Like, there's something really critical about, like, the homo laborans thing, right? Like, when you don't have work to do and things to do and activities to move you forward and changes in your life, when you're, like, enclosed with people and all of that's happening, it starts to feel, without progression. And then you also don't have, like, the hunter-gatherer joy of looking for berries. Like, the father's the only one who goes out and does any of that. And Lisa can't quite process why, right? Because there aren't animals. She doesn't believe in them because he never comes back with anything. So I think that there's that experience time is so, right, there's something dehumanizing about the absence of time, and to measure it is to give something like a measurement of loss, but also a measurement of progress. Why are things slowly shifting toward this feel? When did mom start to stay in bed all day? Like, when did my brothers buy the joints? Like, by trading clothes? And when did my friend go away? And all that kind of stuff. I think that becomes a big part of what, both because it's a child storyteller, but also because the absence of that shifts, right? Like, the need to have something in memory and to mark that in memory so you can feel your own growth and progression is pretty critical in that frankness that she uses.
I like that image of scratching the numbers in Bastille, and that, like, I think, it almost could be a cover image for this story. So it is tracking days in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would point out is that when we move through the diary sections, or sections where it's like February this happened, March this happened, so on, sometimes we get one of the present tense scenes talking about something that happened in the diary, so that we actually see it, whether it's before it happens in the diary or after it happens in the diary.
Yeah.
So that's another way that kind of alters, I suppose, our perspective a little bit, but also Lisa's. And, like, we see that the memory and the diary do match up, but they don't always match up, like, right at the moment she writes it in the diary, which is all to say that the diary is a strange device in wish to provide information, because if you've ever diaried, right, like, you go back and you're like, I don't remember this at all. Like, why was I mad about this? Or, like, I don't remember going to this place. Or, it's not one of the things that sticks in your mind. But here, like, our attention is drawn sometimes to those moments that happen. And I'm not exactly certain, other than to say that, the memory of people in this time where less and less of the outside world is available, the more their minds wander. Because there is nothing, like, piquing their interest, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a really interesting thing. Another way that time changes is when Lisa describes the man in the dog suit, who is called Prince eventually because Lisa names him eventually. Because the man in the dog suit comes to their door, they feed him trash, and after a while he sticks around even after the father threatens to shoot the dog when he finds the dog there after coming back from one of his hunting trips. And Lisa describes the dog's smell over time, the dog's teeth and gums over time.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And how they shift. because the man doesn't have access to a toothbrush, for example, or shower, and so the strange thing about the dog is like the dog comes one day and there's continued argument over the dog for quite some time, and then eventually the dog becomes a regular inhabitant of the porch right outside the home. And so everyone sees the dog all the time. The dog is there. And, for a lot of the time after they initially kind of get over the fact that the man in the dog suit is willing to eat garbage and act like a dog and stay on the porch, they kind of forget about him, except for Lisa and, honestly, the mother. From time to time, the men in the family make jokes about the dog. They say the dog's dangerous, don't get close to the dog. The dog is trying to get in your pants to the women. All of these things that the men are afraid of. And, that happens from time to time, but they don't do anything about it, right? And so the dog remains. And so one thing to think about with this story, I think, is the arrival of the dog and the end of the dog's journey at this house are strange markers throughout the story for, like, how the people are feeling. And, the story's called Dog Days, which, of course, I joked with Ingrid before we read the story, or I read the story, about the dog days of summer, and wondering if that had anything to do with that. And, in fact, it kind of does. Yeah. Insofar as, like, the dog days of summer are, like, the days where it's, like, so hot and, like, you're like, it's never going to, like, cool off. And, vacation's going to go on forever, especially for kids in school. And then all of a sudden, like, something happens and it's like, now it's like September. And you got to go back to school. You got to get your shit together. Like, life is going to happen again. But, of course, here, because the war is happening, they lose things instead of gaining things.
Yeah, I think I really love what you have to say, especially about the story's form, like the examples that both of you gave about how we get the particular markers of time, but also how we move from those present tense scenes to these kind of diary entries and back again. Because, I mean, it's a very accessible, readable story where, you have to be thinking like an editor or someone who's studying writing and craft to even notice that, I think. I experience it as very smooth, but I think especially in a story where you're dealing with those dog days and the repetition of time, it would be easy for the form to get a little boring, especially if you're repeating the month in the same way all the time, or not integrating those present scenes. And I think Budnitz is really smart in that handling, the way she handles that. So harping on Bergson a little bit, I did bring him in, just thinking, I'm excited about him lately, but I think this notion of like clock time and calendar time as opposed to like the time of like memory, which can be experienced in this much longer way, in a way that doesn't attach itself very well to the clock. I wanted to think about that a little, to sit with Lisa, the narrator, and think about the attention that she pays to time when it comes to like her inner self, the time we feel.
Well, I think, she mostly kind of gauges feeling on what the other people are doing. And since her father leaves every day, at the beginning, he's laid off from the factory. He comes home and he just drinks and watches the news and sits in front of the TV. And, finally that goes away, and like then he starts going out every day. So she's not really in a place to connect with him.
Mm.
And so I think one of his major roles is like the overarching feeling in the house is oppressive. She does more closely try to watch her brothers, but the brothers are teenagers and they're in the basement reading Playboys. They're, as Adam said, giving away their clothes to smoke weed. At one point later in the story, they even break into a house and try to find food and are hauled back by the government officials, the army, whoever, and told if they do it again, they'll be taken away. And so often a lot of what she describes is the things she does see that they do. And, I guess her mom at one point takes to the bed and like stays in the bed for an extended period. Like we never really see her get out of the bed until late in the story. Because at first her job is to feed the family. The dad so eloquently yells at her to find him some food early on the story.
Yeah.
And, she tries to stay busy with cleaning and, keeping things up in the home and like finding a purpose for herself, but there's not a whole lot of purpose to be gleaned. And so, Lisa focuses on those things that she can see and think about these people. And she focuses on like her relationship to Prince, which actually is the one that really grows because Prince is willing to hang out with her and play fetch with her and listen to her and sing with her, even though he acts like he's a dog when he's singing with her. And like, things like this where she believes Prince loves her at least to the extent of an animal, like, and would not hurt her. Yeah. And so, I think that takes up a lot of the story, but near the beginning and near the end, we get a lot of like what her life used to be like. Hanging out with Marjorie every Friday, and then like what she did during the week. At one point she says, quote, "I've been writing things down in my diary month after month. I'm beginning to lose track of the days. They all run together. I remember when every day was different. Monday was music day at school. Wednesday I had piano lessons. Friday I went to Marjorie's house. Now they are all the same." Right? So like everything, as we've already kind of discussed, has been packed together, and there's nothing to demarcate when something happens, especially because I believe late in the story, the newspaper's cut off entirely by the government. It used to come once a week, and all of these things like progressively go away as we move through the year. So like one month, something happens and is taken away. And the next month, again, something happens and is taken away. And so I think like the really fun things, for me at least, are like when we get specifics about like what she and Marjorie did. Like my favorite thing in the story is she says early on, quote, "My friend Marjorie lived 2.5 blocks away and I went there. Marjorie had 2 long ponytails and always thought of things to do. She taught me to hang by my knees and how to make a grass stem buzz between my thumbs. Once we drew faces on our stomachs and made them talk to each other and kiss." And like that provides very specific things, I think, emotionally, that Lisa is missing. And that in some points, the story actually elides. Like, to the point where people aren't talking to each other about how they feel. People are, complaining about things.
Yeah.
And so I think that's like one of the hard things here is that, like, emotionally, everyone is bereft. And, things are so hard that, like, they really can't even afford to give anything out to the homeless or the beggars that come early on. And Prince only gets to stays because, he will eat the scraps. He will take care of the problem of garbage for them. And so I think, the emotional thing, especially the drawing the faces on the stomach and making them talk to each other and kiss, is one of the things that really pops out to me in this story as like, the thing that's missing is right there, but it's only missing because of the war.
Yeah. That was the whole trajectory of things. And I appreciate that. I've got so many thoughts, and I'm going to process them and turn to some tangential ones of my own, but I am going to do that through the Marjorie thing, right? Like, I think part of the Bergson, it's been, a couple of years since I've read any Bergson, right? But, like, I think that there's a difference between the moment at which you teach me to hang from my knees, right? And then there's a number of times that I might hang from my knees, right? And then there's the description of periodically putting a piece of grass between your thumbs and making it make a noise. And then there's one time that we paint our bellies and make the faces on our bellies kiss, right? All of those things within the list seem to take on equal weight, but within the context of real time, they actually take up differing amounts of time. And that's a weird but normal effect of memory that we describe an ongoing thing, which is really like, like a stop motion shot, or like a zoomed up, or like a sped up kind of like long shot. And we put that next to, in montage, something that we're recreating in real time of like the slow way and awkward way we're trying to like lean our stomachs together, right? So I think that's one weird thing that always happens, and it's part of, I think, childhood especially. Those memories are really vivid. I think, Matthew, you intelligently point out like that the smell of prints over time, or the brother's pimples over time, right? There's an inferred causality that's marking the way we experience time, but it's not, it's a steady progression. It's not a measured progression. And I mean, months are not all even in the way that we parse them out, but we do have a delusional relationship that they are, right? But part of the way that we mark those things is about keeping something even and measurable and experienceable, right? The sun goes around the earth and it takes X amount of time, and we experience that in the day and night. We want to parse that out. We want to say, okay, why does that do that? How do we do that? And what we get tools, right? We like put evenly spaced lines on a little thing, and we let the sun go over, and as the sun moves, we get our little sundial, right? And we go, okay, we're going to mechanize that, right? And the little clicks that we hear are going to be the seconds ticking away. And then, you develop neuroses about it, right? Like it's a cliche that like you're up at 3 a.m. and listening to just your clock go tick, 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 and thinking about your inevitable death coming at you, right? And I think that that's a weird thing that a child really shouldn't have to deal with, right? Like I think most children Lisa's age are busy, when they tell you a story, they're like, this thing happened, like in this, they're very present tense people, and oftentimes they will say like, and we do this, right? Like as if, whether it's the like one time we had our stomachs kissed, or whether it's all the time we hang from our knees and make little grass whistles, or one time she did this thing, all right? Like that, those things, they have this different relationship that's being skewed for her, and she's actually being forced to look and experience that time very, very differently than I think children do when they've been given structure, that Monday's this day at school, Wednesday's this day at school, and then they're living in the present, where here, because that's been taken away, she's, I think, thinking more in adult terms about time. She's thinking about causality more directly. She's thinking about progression more directly, and maybe at a time in her life when that would start to enter the picture, but it feels very imposed by having to look at the details and thus coming to conclusions about the dog's smell or what have you.
Yeah, I think all of that is really seeing of the story. I first encountered Bergson through a BBC podcast on Virginia Woolf, actually. She was familiar with his work, and in the hours they were thinking about the ways in which his work may have influenced her, and one of the commentators described memory in that book as kind of like falling into a deep pool, and you stay with the memory, and it's actually like sometimes long on the page. I think this story treats Bergson in such a different way, and I think you guys are getting at that. Emotionally and in terms of memory, like it's not that the scene that you read, Matthew, is long and expansive. Actually, on the page, it's a small paragraph, but you understand because of the way the story is communicating those moments that, like, that's where the heat is, that's where the emotionality is, and that's where the life is. That this tracking isn't it, that's the dog days part. Yeah. And likewise, Adam, I think you're really getting at that too.
Yeah. Well, I think Dalloway's a different kind of book, right? Like that it's
no, I spent the hours thinking of getting it, but yeah.
Yeah, but that is my point. But it's just right. Dalloway's so engaged in memory and moment to moment stuff. It is in some ways, right, like all of those characters are rejecting real life. And so they're going through regimented days, trying to not experience anything. Or they're trying to experience their lives and not experience everything in their lives. Which is also true of the hours, by the way. But, in this case, I think, you can't not be a kid and not experience everything, which is part of why childhood is so profound that way, right? Like the details of everything become so big and real, and as an adult, I also want to dress up in a dog suit and behave as simply as possible and just escape it all, right?
We'll see where that goes.
My sister had a dog suit for a while, so I'm handy. Sorry, just to play host for a second. I put my foot in my mouth a little. So, The Hours is Mrs. Dalloway's original title, and then Michael Cunningham later used that title. So, just a clarification thing.
Yeah.
So speaking of causality, let's talk about Lisa and her mom and Prince also. I think we haven't yet said about Prince, also adding some context that Lisa at least speculates that he might be intellectually deficient in some ways.
She drops the R word. Yes.
Yeah, she does indeed. So, looking at Lisa and her mom, how do these characters change over time? We've talked about Lisa in that regard a little bit already. And how much of that change is causal or situational? Like, how does the world act on them? And how are other characters influencing the two of them, especially with an eye toward Prince, who we haven't talked about that much yet. I think you guys have done a great job kind of filling in bits and pieces about him, though.
Yeah, I think that a lot of, right, your kid, especially if you're in a sort of Americanized or westernized school system, you spend most of your days when you're in school, which are about half of your life's days, looking at other children, right? And most children actually spend a lot of time, at least in America, with other children. Like, the intergenerational thing is varyingly limited, right? Like, and right, like, in that way you end up, you don't like see your own, like, you feel your own knobby knees and you feel awkward about it or whatever, right? But you see development often either sort of in mirrors, but as comparisons to other people, I think, is a major part of that, right? Development, even in that moment where she's describing Marjorie, she does it quickly. Marjorie always has the ideas, right? So this is a different, like, so she feels stripped of the person who brings her the ideas, but she's also not seeing her own growth and change. We don't actually, you experience her mental change, her experiential change, but the way in which, right, she sort of knows and reflects on growth in general, right, like, is recognizing that her brothers are developing more pimples. Mm-hmm. Therefore, imagining they spend so much time down there thumbing the, Playboys, that they must be imaginatively kind of wrecked. And I think that's interesting, right? Like, and I think you have to learn to do that as a kid in part and see those reflections with other changing bodies, because adult people shift slower. And so those sort of like growth behaviors you have to understand through people who are also going through those behaviors to some degree, right? I think that's an interesting thing about her. I think the mother's slow creep toward depression, right, like, is, I think the mother, like a lot of these characters, are not, they don't know how to communicate with each other very well. And the effect of that is that they're a little bit, not only because Lisa is a child, but also because they're poor communicators. They appear a little flat at times, right? Yeah. And so there's these small moments that the mother just goes out on a limb and decides to feed Prince, who doesn't have a name yet, who's just a weird dog man out there. And then that she sort of justifies the need for that new company with, like, that Prince is scaring off the other beggars because none of them will come around now that this weird dog suit man is out there. But also, there's something a little flat about her snapping at one of the boys for, like, saying that Prince was trying to, like, hadn't seen tail in a long time, and, like, tells that kind of crude, like, double entendre. But we don't see the mother going to the bedroom. We just learn that she spends a time. So I think that's a strange, you see that progression through Lisa, and often in the way that it's that time collapse. This is the time when mom was in bed, right? Which is part of the month thing.
Yeah, exactly.
October now. And within that context, the days are blending, and she knows this, but, like, somebody at some point, whether it's the newspaper or dad scratching something on the wall, she's got a notion that this is the block of time in the diary. This is the kind of thing that was happening during this period, in the way that, like, if she'd been floating around in 2018 or something, right? Like, she might have said, and this was the summer we were all playing with fidget spinners, right? Like, so we're catching those kind of clump things in terms of progression with the mother, especially, I think, because the father doesn't change much, and the brothers just get more physically grotesque.
I think I have a hard time divorcing causality and situational circumstances in this story, because everything is predicated on things being taken away. And thus the war is the causality, and like what happens afterwards is all situations based on that causality. And so in that respect, you know, I go back to what is taken away. And, you know, the interesting thing being that the one thing that is given is the dog, Prince. And he's both strange and a gift. He takes up a lot of Lisa's time. She likes petting him and cuddling with him and talking with him. And I think like the one thing that really stands out is while her mother is also nice to the dog, Lisa's really the one that in the end is nicest to the dog. Because she takes the dog eventually at the dog's word, which there is no word, right? But the dog's word is that, like, I will be here.
Yeah.
I will be here. I will be here. And everybody else in her family will not.
Yeah.
And so, you know, at first she thinks the dog is mentally challenged. She thinks the man is crazy. She says, but it's a man. Like, you can't treat it like a dog. And, like, over time, that's the big shift, I think, for me in the story, is, like, her realizing, like, it doesn't matter if he's a man or a dog, man. Like, this being is here for me. And the other beings in my life are all going through mental issues or trauma based on the war and what is not available, that they can't be here for me. And, you know, I don't know that it necessarily works the other way as much. Just trying to think about, like, is she there for the other people in her life? But I mean, is that a fair question because of her age? And, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I think I totally do, because, right, like, when you're a kid and your brother's like, screw you, we're doing something important out here, right? And you know that it's, like, your brother looking at porno, right? But, like, and that might happen one time or two times, like, you know, and there can be a tendency to, like, forget other times when, like, there's interaction. Or eventually, right, there is the scene where the family slowly, like, starts to just spend time in the same room and sort of not communicate. But that human presence is really necessary for them. I don't think, like, the obligation to impose that on Lisa and say, how dare she not attend to her depressed mother more, right? Like, the situation infers that, like, no one except maybe differently depressed father is, like, in an adult enough position to be the support network, but the situation is also vastly beyond them by all, like, indicators from, like, he lost his job, he knows there's no point. You think that might, at first, right, this story does this trick in introducing the guy with the dog, but also with the father losing his job, of making it seem like either of these things is more normal than it is.
Yeah, just depressive logic. I mean, it sounds like things.
Yeah,
like people say in much more ordinary situations.
Yeah, like, just I got laid off and I'm busy drinking my way through the news instead of, like, applying somewhere. And which isn't to say the father is sensitive or on top of his shit. It's to say that, like, he happens to be right in that instance. And so, but what I give him is just, it's all beyond all of them. But, like, I don't think she's giving much, right? Like, she's the one who drifts out of the room to go hang out with Prince while the other people are just trying to be humanly present because they don't have any contact, right? The person she spends time with, the mother disappears for a while, but Lisa goes and visits her friend's abandoned home, apparently repeatedly trying to, like, connect. And I think that's I don't think that's on her for not giving to someone else, but I know what you mean, because there's something about what she's not getting at home that's making it hard for her to give back to anyone either. And because, like, even at 13 to 18, I can't imagine the boys are only masturbating like to Playboys. Like the other things are happening in the house, and she's not capable of seeing them, and maybe has been shut out from that by people who can't engage for all the reasons they can't engage, whoever they were. That's the other thing, is because of the trick of the story, it doesn't feel like we're in chaos at the beginning. We have an idiosyncratic man in a dog suit, and we have a father who's lost his job. But even if you track the story's chronology and you put it in even time, there's never a time where things are, at least within the context of her country, normal, right? Which is a pretty big chaos. So we don't, I think from the adult perspective, we never get much from the mother, and we never get much from the father, who's remarkably quiet. So we don't really ever get insight into, were these good parents beforehand? Are these teenage brothers anything other than like teenage boys? Or are these like, would these be teenage boys who go in and break into homes for kicks if they weren't? We don't know any of that, and we never will, at least not from the story that we have.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Matthew's point about the causal and situational being so closely tied, the situation engulfs them, encompasses all they're doing. So, I mean, it becomes the driving causality within the story. And, I mean, the reportage is minimal throughout, but there's the awareness we have as readers, too, that, like, Lisa's losing a dramatic amount of weight. That they're all hungry,
Yeah.
and I mean, actually like functioning at less than full capacity as people as the story wears on. I also want to touch quickly on what got said about Prince and Lisa and their relationship, because I think it's so much of the heart of the story, and I think the change there is really crucial. That she is wary of Prince at first, and that it's her mom and her mom's kindness toward Prince initially that helps her toward Prince to some extent, although their attitudes are different. Her mom says of Prince, it's an interesting logic, it's one of my favorite parts of this story, that because he believes he's a dog, he is a dog. Which, I mean, coming from an adult is, an interesting perspective there, and I mean, not one that I necessarily think, that I necessarily judge, but that I feel like quizzical about as a reader. I think Lisa's attachment to Prince over time feels like it's not about accepting her mom's logic. It's about like an initial permission to engage with Prince, him being allowed onto their property and into their lives. And I mean, Matthew, like you said, like the story is so much about taking away. He's someone who enters into the scene, and also, he's a presence. He's there, and she pays a lot of attention to the way in which his eyes are kind of like actual dog eyes, and you get the sense that there's an understanding between them and a connection that slowly forms that's about time spent together.
Yeah, I think, your thing about, right, like Lisa recognizing her own like weight loss, for instance, which is weird, right? Like she notices that she's looking more model-esque as a result, which, says something horrifying about the lasting impact of like the social influences that we have, that like in a situation where no one's noticing this little girl that she thinks of herself as more attractive because she's being incidentally starved by a war, But I think that kind of detail ends up being some of where this story does a lot of its subtle work in these kinds of ideas, in contrast to something like that he's a dog because he thinks he's a dog, right? Which is going to get challenged by the end. We haven't brought this up, but feels important to know that, like, Prince doesn't make it to the end of the story, doesn't make it out alive. And it's because the father has bought into that mother's logic, right, of Prince being, he doesn't buy into the logic necessarily. They're starving, and he's choosing to cannibalize Prince, the dog. And I think there are weird facts of, what's it, the Emperor of San Francisco? I don't know. I can't remember what this guy's title was. It's neither here nor there. Guy in San Francisco who sort of like claimed himself the king or the emperor of San Francisco. I think there are things that, like, right, especially in extremist circumstances, but sort of in all circumstances, right? If you decide, right, like every day that you being alive is what brings the sun up every day, you're never going to be proven wrong within your own experience, right? Because as soon as you're dead, you're just not going to see that the sun comes up if it continues to come up the day after, right?
But even that's based on a fallacy. The sun doesn't actually come up.
Yeah, I mean, it's... But you, like...
I know what you mean.
Yeah. No, I think it's like you experience life, and we all have delusional beliefs that way, but also, like, a lot of our beliefs sort of, like, bully us, right? Like, I'm a failure. Like, this is terrible. Like, this is the worst thing. Like, it's... Or even, like, it's Marjorie that has the ideas, right? Like, but, right, like, when Lisa fantasizes about going on dates with Rick Dees, right? Like, she's not really going on a date with Rick Dees, but to the degree that that fantasy life is more rewarding than, you know, no insult to Rick Dees, maybe he's a great date, but, like, you know, is more rewarding than it could possibly be for, like, a child to go on a date, right? Like, that imagined thing is big and it's real and it's exciting and it's as good as it gets, you know? And I think that, like, but also in the way that, like, we, you know, we believe in the things that we believe, right? Like, no one's really the king of you, right? Like, it's just, I mean, they might have, what they have is, like, other people believe that they're the king, and so they will exercise force against you for not cooperating with the king. But, like, you could say that you're the king of America, and no one's going to contradict you unless you become a danger to someone else. And I think that there's something weird about that your delusions are fine. It's okay to say that the sun comes up if you're not, like, an astronomer, right? Like, because functionally that's what it kind of looks like, you know? But, like, I think in that way that Prince is doing this thing where, like, he gets that, the mother gets to, I don't know how serious any of this is, right? She's stressed out. She's tired of, like, being ignored by her husband. Her kids are driving her nuts. There's a war going on. Like, I don't know how much she believes the Prince thing when she says it, but I know that she's not entirely wrong if what she means is, like, we all have delusional beliefs. This one happens to be a harmless delusional belief, and there's nothing that Prince ever does that contradicts that, right? Prince, except for getting up on two legs to run away from being shot at the end of the story, Prince is as much of a dog as a dog is. And I don't know that that's the world's worst ambition.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that the phrase that you brought up, Ingrid, that says that the mother says, you know, if he believes he's a dog, is born out of, like, social politics. Yeah. And that's really crazy to me because it's a form of politeness to do this, and yet, you know, it ignores the politeness that would be correct and being like, hey, why don't you come on in and like eat some of our food, man? Like, instead of like laying out here on the porch, you know, day after day, and it gets colder and colder, you know, like it's the thing where it's like, well, this is the polite thing to do, and this is how you do it, by keeping someone at arm's distance, and treating them humanely enough.
Yeah.
Not humanely enough.
Yeah, I love that point. And just to give a little context, what Matthew's saying there is like the mother's logic around this also is a logic of politeness. Like she's saying that part of why she wants to feed Prince and take care of him and treat him as a dog is because especially treat him as a dog is because he believes that, and thus it's polite.
Yeah. Although if it's an act, right, like to your humanely enough, they get to turn away all the other beggars, and they're mean to the other beggars. But the dog,
if it's an act, it's a brilliant act.
It's a brilliant act.
If it is an act.
Yeah.
But I think a couple of quick things. One, Rick Dees was a radio DJ. We didn't really say that.
Yeah.
And Lisa really liked his voice on the radio, and imagine him being suave like his voice is suave on the radio.
Mm-hmm.
Showing our age by knowing that fact and treating it like everyone does.
And then I think the other thing I've been thinking about, possibly because I've been reading Jane Smiley's A Year at the Races, is, and this is a book Jane Smiley wrote about horses because she's been a huge horse owner, and she's always loved riding horses. She eventually got into horses and like taking them to the track and so on. Anyway, she talks about the intelligence of horses and, you know, trying to think about the intelligence of animals versus the intelligence of humans. And, you know, she talks about this one horse who, as long as this horse can go and like check out the jumps or the gates or the cars, right, the things that are potentially dangerous, the horse is okay. But if you try to take the horse in there without letting the horse check these things out, the horse is going to not cooperate. Mm-hmm. It's going to throw you off. It's going to, you know, run. It's not going to do what it's told. Right? And so I think one of the things maybe like we forget about all the time is the intelligence of animals is not quantifiable in our language. And, you know, the intelligence of humans is even continually up for debate in that obviously psychology continues to put out different DSMs every so many years. And so like that's like the interesting thing about all of this to me is like just imagining like yourself in that situation, whether you're part of the family, whether you're the guy that's the dog, you know, whatever, because like there's no easy answer here. And there's no answer. Like what we do as a society tends to be like, well, this is probably the least harmless thing for the majority of the population, so we're going to stick with that.
Yeah. And
then someone comes along and it's like, yeah, but actually, blah, 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 and that gets changed down the road, and it keeps happening like that. And so, like, you know, we're talking about this now, and like 100 years from now, if humans are still around, you know, it'll be like another thing where it's like, you know, they used to say this back in the day, but like that is, it's just, it's an unintelligible thing to say because we have all of this new knowledge or this new perspective on ourselves as people.
Yeah, so you're kind of on a like Foucauldian like, how are we dealing with the disease situation?
Yeah,
and yeah, no, I think that's like right, and what's acceptable medicine, right? Like which is both about how do we treat it, right? If he's a dog, do we need to convince him to act like a man and take care of himself and be upright and marry someone and have a, you know, house and kids or whatever? Or do we let him be a dog because that's his thing, which might shift in time. That's actually, you know, in this case, for all the talking about time we've done, right? Like the father's acceptance of that over time, the mother's concern for that, Lisa's developmental love for him as a dog.
Yeah, let me interrupt you here. This is leading right into my next question. So when I first read this story, I remember thinking of the man in the dog suit as a character who, like, in the confusion, the compassion, the pity, the distrust, the revulsion that he inspires and the characters around him reveals a great deal about their temperaments. You could think of him as a mirror, a litmus test, a metric of some kind. So we've talked a little bit about Lisa and her relationship to Prince over time, and the mom a little bit, but let's talk about the father and his relationship to Prince and the brothers a little as well.
I mean, the brothers, I think, generally think it's funny because they think he's crazy. They enjoy poking fun at everything, and the man in the dog suit is an easy target. They are, however, somewhat reticent to have the dog there because that is not what you do in this society. And at the beginning, they go out and beat the dog and make him go away because that's what men in the family do. And so, after it's finally kind of settled that it's okay that the dog's here, they generally just make fun of it and ignore it for the most part. I think the father all along had been adamant that they don't allow this man in the dog suit to stay. And so at the beginning, Lisa and her mother are feeding the dog surreptitiously while Harold is out hunting or whatever he's doing out there with his gun. And so only when he comes back and catches them on the porch with the dog does he, say he's going to shoot the dog. Of course, it's a crazy scene from start to finish because he's pointing the gun at the dog who's right next to Lisa and her mother. And so already he's beyond, the limits of sanity in so far as, at that point, he is apparently somewhat willing to shoot Lisa or her mother, along with this man who's in the dog suit. I think over time he becomes, somewhat ambivalent about the dog, not really caring so much that he's there for quite a long time over the summer. Eventually he goes and says, "Hey, I'll give you my own clothes if you'll get up and walk like a man and talk to me and we can have a conversation." And the man in the dog suit just remains in his dog state, persona, whatever you want to call it. I think it is really fascinating that other people that had been coming around for food or shelter are not coming around because the man in the dog suit is there. And my question is, what is it about him other than his perceived craziness, and I put that in air quotes, by the way, is keeping them away from the home? The only thing that comes to mind is that, if they're feeding this guy in the dog suit, they're not going to feed me. If they're housing this guy in the dog suit, they're not going to house me. That's the line or something.
Yeah, Adam, can you take that one on, and also can you talk a little? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that moment of confrontation between the father and Prince, and what the father says to Prince, and what you feel like it means within the context of the story, or the resonance it has?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Ingrid. That sounds like a convincing start to having an answer. Yeah, I think that like there's something funny about other men's, like, maybe I'm kind of imposing that like most of the beggars are men. I think it's because I imagine the whole thing is a little bit like an like during the Great Depression era, like you had hobo symbols, like these people will feed you, or whatever. That like in some ways, right? Like the dog is the best and worst hobo symbol of all time, because that hobo in the dog suit is always there, but also, right, like he's a little bit like, he's intimidating, he's weird, there's something not right about that situation, but also maybe it's that they see that the man with the dog suit only gets like literal army ration garbage, which is horrifying.
And it can't be that healthy.
No. So, I mean, we don't get that much information about what kind of garbage this is, but we also know these people are slowly, I mean, it starts before they're going to starve, but like, we are in a kind of Lord of the Flies trajectory toward murder that comes through, right, like the progression of anger and hostility. And I think in that way, some of that's about, this is me leaning into the father, right? That like, I think the men in this story are a little like archetypal, right? Up and down. And what we get about them, I think Budnitz wisely leaves sort of their motivations open. But we do get from the story itself allusions to another man as sexual threat, right? One of the first things is that joke, the tail joke that I mentioned earlier. There's also like in-group, out-group stuff here, right? Like that the father is a failed male supporter, right? He never actually brings home any bacon. Both in that he like loses his job in a literal way, but he also just can't find the animals. And in some ways, right, like apart from the absence of animals in this area that's being like constantly guarded by military vehicles, the father also just like her knowing that animals don't exist elsewhere anymore is largely that her father never brings them home, right? Like she's seeing that through that lens of her own father's failure. To be the masculine ideal in the time of crisis. The sons, to Matthew's point, they're actually more resourceful. They go looking for food. They fail at it. Also failed, but they have a better idea than just taking a gun out to look at nothing every day. But I always kind of imagine that what's actually happening, maybe he sees animals and he shoots at them, and he's just a terrible shot. I don't really know.
Well, it does beg a lot of questions, such as, we're only talking about generally food that is meat. And at one point, I think like there is a grass salad type deal that's eaten and like Lisa throws up and stuff. All right, well that's one thing, but like, what about all the crops? Like, I think that is one of the things where like, depending on where you are, there's going to be fruits, nuts, different types of things like available, and no one in the entire story attempts to go do that other than like in their own yard that just has grass.
Yeah.
Like, why not go look for some food that's still been growing?
Yeah.
Like that is a big question I have.
No, I mean,
I think also, Adam, sorry to put you on the spot before.
No,
I think, I think some of what you're saying about the father and the position of not being able to provide in this, more recently traditional notion of like man as provider, and like 1950s notion. I think for me, that moment feels charged and kind of out of that mentality that because he's unable to be a man himself, he's kind of like reaching out and projecting and interacting with Prince in that way, like wanting manhood back in the picture.
Yeah.
For them both, for him, for himself mostly though.
Yeah, I mean,
I feel like you were.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's true.
That's what I see in that moment mainly.
Yeah, I think it's also that he's. I agree. Like, this is a yes and thing, right? Like that. He needs him to stand up. He's willing to give him, right? Like, this is a very like Ronald Reagan mentality. Like, I will only give you this much if you go and bootstrap it in the way that I imagine is the right way to be. But I mean, like, also the other time we get the dad, right? Like, interacting with Prince, like, directly, is this moment where, like, he walks up, he does the whole business with the gun. Howard, let him stay. He's not doing any harm, says my mother. Please, Dad, I say. And Dad, I don't know why, cocks his head and says, okay, and stomps into the house. A moment later, he calls to my mother to find him something to eat. Right? Like, it's a retaliatory manhood. I mean, maybe this is always how he acts. It's just like, give me some food, you know? Like, but it's also this, like, I've lost something, so I have to have face again. And there's something about a man that, like, and I think it's because it's gender mirroring, I guess I would call it, right? It's like, right, like, that because someone else who is male is capable of falling into this state of disrepair, right? Like, you imagine your own, like, this is where I could land if I don't do this, which leads to these kind of, like, sinister ideas, right? Like, really, I'm talking about my fear, not you being a dog. Like, the mother, to my point about the mother being right, that it's sort of harmless whether or not he's the dog. It doesn't matter. If he's not upset about being a dog, what's our obligation to raise him up as a man? And it's usually the father's motivation. It's, I don't want to see you as a reflection of what someone I identify with through my genitals could be, right?
Yeah, I think mirroring is an interesting word here too. There's one moment late in the story that also is really charged in terms of gender that we've like come close to talking about, where Lisa has gotten really thin, has lost a lot of weight, is looking in the mirror and thinking about how now she looks, more like a model, and she's talking to herself, not her family at that point, and she starts to imagine in the mirror, like, her friend Marjorie in the background. Am I getting that right? I feel like I'm butchering.
Oh, here it is.
A little bit.
Yeah, here we go. Quote, my legs are nice and thin now, and my bones stick out of my face in a nice way. I look like the models in the magazines. I know this because I spend a lot of time in my room now, looking in the mirror. I don't want to be with my parents, or Pat, or Elliot, so I sit with the mirror to keep me company. The mirror behaves. We have conversations. Sometimes if I squint really hard into the mirror, I can see Marjorie there in the mirror room, smiling at me.
Yeah, I think a moment like that where you're taking actually kind of like a usual gendered complaint, a young kid thinking being like too thin is a good thing because of magazines, and like Budnitz does this thing where she stays with that and, renders it in the usual way and then gets so weird with it. I love it. But tangents. Let's get to the ending, and I have a kind of highfalutin final question about it.
Falute away.
Okay. So in his acceptance speech for the 1949 Nobel Prize in Literature, Faulkner says, it's a pretty short speech. I'd really recommend it if you haven't read it. But this is just a little piece of it. Our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There's only the question, when will I be blown up? Because of this, the young man or woman writing today has forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat. Shoot, every time I come across that, it gives me chills. I'm wondering if you two could talk about this story generally with that portion of Faulkner's speech in mind. So, it's not a post-apocalyptic story. It's a war story, but it's got this apocalyptic feel. It's a kind of end time in its way. And I think especially with those kinds of stories, all have been in vogue. I think to Faulkner's point, it's really difficult to write a story of that kind to Faulkner's standards, to really make it about the human heart in conflict with itself. When does this story become about fear, about the baser things that these characters need to survive? And when is it looking at the human spirit, at humanity?
Yeah, there is probably a difference between the human spirit and humanity in my mind, in a pretty immediate way, and I think we're starting to look by the end at sort of like need, but whether or not we ever get to Faulknerian concern with the human spirit is an open question for me. I think that like post-apocalyptic has always been a weird term in my head. Because I think that
to use it for a reason.
Well, I think that what's strange about it is, right, like whether or not we believe that there's anything after the end times, and that the end times should, right, like, or if we're just moving forward and the next thing happens, and the next thing happens, and the next thing happens. And it's funny that term sort of emerges as a secular term of like, disaster will befall us, but we're still going to be living there. And then it usually describes, actually, I think, this kind of story where disaster, the kind of impending disaster, Faulkner's talking about the atomic bomb, right? Like it's right after that became a real thing in our lives. But you don't think about it most days, right? Like that there's still enough like atomic weaponry in the world to just kill all of us, like pretty quick. But also I think that like there's something about our lives in general that have come with maybe the two Great War period, maybe like high capitalism to late capitalism to wherever we are at now in the Bitcoin era. Maybe like there's sort of an Arcadian notion of like there being more human spirit before that everyone from Faulkner and Tolstoy, like they're kind of like fantasizing about that, like the real times, right? Like something from like Descartes to like before like Darwin. It's like those were the real men were men and women were women and people felt things. But I do think that like there is a real effect of a long sustained fear, right? Like and it doesn't take that long to get to, right? Like again, to think out like living through like a pandemic and like people going from like paranoia to like, oh, this is real and I'm very, very scared now and I'm going to avoid everyone, to like, I have to get out of this fucking house and I'm like willing to die to do it, right? Like that, I think that kind of progression can happen in like a month for people, right? Like, which is a bit bonkers. I think in this story, right, like the end times have come for these people. And what they don't do is pick up and leave the house. what they don't do, like most people left the neighborhood. There's something stagnant and depressive and like, passive about these people, that this family, that they're going to just take this at its own word, right? They're not going to go out and run away. They're just going to wait until they can't leave. They're not going to experiment too much with military force. Even the boys, they go out one time searching for food, but then they don't ever do it again because they get caught. They'd rather sit at home and let their mother try and boil grass. There's something really beaten down by those people, about those people, right? There's something inhuman about that refusal to pursue your own needs or your own curiosities or your own, like, to move past that. But I think it's not just the bomb. There's something apocalyptic. There's something nuclear about some of the kinds of imagery of mass media that enter into the story. But I think that happen in that same era after the war, right? The We're America advertising men kind of time when, right, like you could print 1 million copies of a magazine and boys across America and across the world could thumb through them and look at the same woman, like, standing there showing off her breasts, right? Like, and all fantasize that she's there, right? Like, I just watched Apocalypse Now for the first time in many, many years. And I don't know if this was the Redux. I don't know if this was in the original one, but at one point, Martin Sheen's character trades gasoline, right? Like a necessary thing for the mission in order to get the guys on the boat he's with time with these Playboy girls who are doing USO shows, right? And they're sort of indifferent to the whole affair, and just trying to talk to these guys who are, going at them. And one of the guys is dressing up this girl so that she matches. He wants her to be Miss May, but she's really Miss December, or vice versa. And so she's, for whatever reason, having sex with him, or going to have sex with him, but he's got to get the wig on her and get her to stand so he can see the picture of her. I think there's something sort of horrifying about this story. Like, for me, you never get to that kind of old verities thing that, like, Faulkner's so hung up on in that speech. I think what you do get is why these people are beaten down and don't have the verities in them, right? It's that Lisa's fantasy person is Rick Dees, who she's never seen because he's a radio voice. She's basing that on his voice every week, and she thinks that she's singing what she calls Rick Dees' favorite songs, right? Like, Rick Dees did this show called the Weekly Top 40. It's not Rick Dees' favorite songs. It's the most popular songs in America based on a certain number of sales and, like, plays and that sort of thing, right? Like, there's something sort of mortifying about the complicity there, that even the doubt that the newspaper is real doesn't stop Dad from reading the newspaper and, like, looking for code in it. There's something very totalitarian about that. There's something very horrifying about that. And I think Budnitz is asking a question about that includes why someone full-on takes on being a dog.
I think Faulkner's quote here is really interesting in that, he's saying there's no longer any problems with the spirit because we're all worried about being bombed. I think, as Adam has very well discussed, for that time, it's obviously a very true thing. But I think even beyond that, he means there's no longer, like, I think often people struggle with their spirit and, like, who they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to do in this world because there are no answers. And, society has already been set up before you're born. And so, like, you're born into a system already. And thus, like, the spirit I kind of imagine him talking about is the spirit that you never get or never get to have or cultivate, because you are under rule and under orders. And the majority of people are happy because things are orderly. They can expect X, Y, and Z to happen because, you know, we've got these governments that are going to make sure that they happen. And so, like, I think one of the things he's saying is, like, you know, the problem is, like, we're all thinking on this grand scale and not thinking so much about, like, individuals and, like, what they are capable of and can do and can be. And so, in thinking about that quote with this story, like, they've already been blown up. Like, that's already happened before the story begins. And so, like, the fear is that things aren't going to be the way they used to be. And that's a problem, because my mind has, like, if I'm a character in the story, my mind has already been, like, programmed to understand, like, this is what I'm going to do, this is why I have to do it, and we're just going to keep doing that, right? And so that's the fear. And because the immediate thing that happens in the story is that a man appears in a dog suit, right? Like, that just sets off everything, right? Like, they thought maybe they had more time to kind of see what would play out. But no, it's on their doorstep, literally.
Yeah.
It's here. There's nothing they can do. And so the fear is just that, like, there's no direction. It's a rudderless ship, no map, no nothing. And, you know, I do have to wonder, like, the other big question I had about this story was, how in the hell does the government have enough money, time, people, resources to have military trucks going around the suburbs of some city in America, patrolling and, like, making sure people stay inside? There's no way they have that. There's no way.
I love that, like, the suspension of disbelief is so hard for you with this one.
That's the thing, man. That and the damn food, man. Look, those are the things where I'm like, I can go with it, you know, like.
Yeah.
But like, I also realize, I think, that Lisa, the narrator, at the end of the story, even she is kind of writing things that can't be possible or true. Like, at one point, one of the brothers says, "I hear they eat dogs in Korea." And Lisa says, "The room got darker." Like, no, it didn't. There's no electricity. It's the same darkness it just was. But, like, right, it's an embellishment, and the imagination starts to run. And, like, this is the way imagination runs when it's not given an expanse to run towards wonder, and instead runs towards fear. Yeah. And like, the description of the man running from the father who shoots him in the end, right? That's like the longest paragraph in the story. And, like, the man has time to run like a dog, then get up and run like a man. And the father, who misses the first time, actually hits him the second time, and he can't even walk straight because he's so delirious from not being able to eat or drink water. And somehow he hits the dog. And then he and the sons fall on the man dog, like animals, and snarl and, like, eat him. But, like, all of this, to an extent, is an embellishment in that, like, it couldn't have happened that way, like, in real life. But to Lisa, like, this is the truth. Right. And so I think that is the really interesting thing to me, where, like, my suspension of disbelief on these other two things is, like, part of, like, having Lisa as the narrator. In that, like, you know, That's what she felt.
Yeah.
That's what it seemed like. But, like, was it like that? And that's, I think, important to just consider about, you know, everything. It's like, whatever you think is true, like, okay, that's fine, as we've discussed. But, like, how true is it? And does that matter? How much does that matter?
Yeah.
Yeah, Faulkner's standard here is such a wonderful one and such a high one. You know, I mean, I think you think of the books and stories that meet that standard, and you know, they're among the best. Like Gilead is one that comes immediately to mind as one that is certainly about the human heart in conflict with itself. I think one thing that the reason I wanted to go for such a highfalutin final question is partly because I'm a little contrarian, and I like to think sometimes about like these moments where, you know, someone's saying like, well, but this question of survival isn't the best question, and if we're dwelling on when will we be blown up, and then it's just not the best question. It's not taking us to those verities. I remember reading this and reading the Faulkner speech, and not long after coming to Ingmar Bergman's movie Winter Light, and thinking, oh, here's someone who does it. So you have a character who's very much worried about being blown up, but he's not the main character. And you know, crucially, it's a movie that's so much about life and humanity and existence that fear is simply in the mix. This is a story that's so much driven by survival and by, you know, the tension between like what is animal, what is human. The final line of the story after Prince is shot is they run across the lawn, the pack of them, and fall upon him snarling. So Prince has stood up, he's been on his two legs, and the family has descended upon him snarling. You know, there are those very direct reversals that you get. But, I mean, you also finally do get Lisa trying to go to him. I think this is, of course, like a really different kind of story than one like Gilead. I think interesting though that like you do have Lisa with her unreliability framing it, and her evolution toward something like more feeling toward Prince than to her own kin.
Yeah. Yeah.
You look like you have a thought.
No, I have lots of thoughts. I think that that ends up being part of what's great about the story, right? Like, that it ends up in a space that is maybe more metaphorically significant than it is factually significant, and it leaves a lot of open questions about who we are and how we interact with other people, not only in situations that are remarkable, but in situations that aren't. And I think that's maybe actually what's worth taking home.
Mm.
And see, you know, I might make an argument against the fact that they kill Prince for survival. Someone had an idea and they just did it because, like, they're not thinking, you know?
Yeah.
Prince has been there like 10 months.
Yeah.
Like, this is
that's a fair
the
point.
first
Like,
time they were like, oh, let's eat Prince.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, should we end on that sinister note?
Indeed. Thank you for
All right.
hosting.
Thank you, everyone.